Today I'd like to talk about trade-based money laundering. Now, COVID-19 represents a special challenge for all organisations. As well as exasperating existing concerns, it's ushered in a slew of new ones. If these issues are to be successfully addressed, firms need to understand new and existing risks that pose a threat to business. So, recognising and preventing these problems is now the number one priority for those working to prevent trade-based money laundering. The first of these priorities, in the new reality we inhabit, can be the harder of the two. Trade-based money laundering professionals need to articulate the threat and communicate it to others before preventative measures can take place. So how can we summarise the threat? And I'd like to do this by talking about three key areas. First, by establishing that trade-based money laundering is no longer solely a concern for banks and that its scale and scope is massively underestimated. The typical country-to-country movement of products is no longer the norm, and it's far from unusual for trade within borders to be abused for money laundering purposes. Measures taken to combat the coronavirus are likely to boost the movement of goods and products within borders. The second is by understanding that it's not just about business. Before the pandemic, we had already seen a growing number of consumers buying locally sourced products from producers about whom consumers had some grasp of the provenance. This virus means that purchasing behaviour has shot up exponentially, and it's likely to continue. And thirdly, we must be aware that the huge increase in the number of people now working from home will, for a small minority, be an opportunity to commit false accounting. Criminals are also likely to exploit the search for wider supply chains that firms looking for competitive advantage will seek out in the post-lockdown landscape. So now we know the risks, we need to understand how to spot and combat them. And we can start by putting together a list of key considerations. So let's look at the wider risk. A recurrent concern expressed by those who work in the trade-based finance is that they work in a very process-driven environment, one that follows a set formula for completing tasks. Useful as it is to have expertise concentrated in this way, it can leave trade finance isolated almost into a silo. And it can be distant from some of the other vital departments, such as sanctions and money laundering. Now, this isolation can have the negative effect of preventing effective communication with other important departments looking to detect criminal activity. Stepping outside of the trade finance bubble will allow those who work within it to have a better understanding of the wider risks, and therefore allowing trade finance to see how its works functions with the wider anti-financial crime context. Communication is central to making sure that risks are covered. The ring fencing of the trade finance sector is understandable and it's necessary. Yet its strength is also its weakness. When the control framework is too robust, it doesn't allow much room for nuance and inquiry. Softening this, the trade finance ring fencing lets in other departments and gives trade-based money laundering staff that room to manoeuvre and spot risks. So how can we do this? Well, it's through education and training. A company exposed to fraud will before anything else turn to its bank. So banks need to be educating and training employees on know your customer measures. Furthermore, staff must also be aware that they now have an obligation to know your customer's customer. Merely a KYC on its own is increasingly insufficient. Education doesn't end there. Banks must also disseminate to staff members ways of spotting fraud taking place. So when the behaviour changes, what's causing this? Does it look suspicious? Is it in line with the normal business, or is it extraordinary? Emphasising the cost of getting it wrong for banks is always an effective training technique, and examples are, of course, in legion. But perhaps the most overlooked way of driving home the message is the moral dimension. Social responsibility has steadily grown to become a crucial factor for customers deciding with whom they do business. Employee awareness of this helps reinforce this point. Recognising responsibility. We mentioned earlier that it's no longer just banks who need to be wary of trade-based money laundering. Suppliers and buyers also need to be alert to these risks. This means that responsibility for trade-based money laundering is now diffused. Every supplier you now work with is important. The risks are too great to be overlooked, and as such, responsibility lies with every trade finance team member to perform their function in a way that takes into account risk holistically. A vital feature of this is reviewing the control framework around trade-based money laundering risk. But make sure you do this on a regular basis. COVID-19 has inherently altered the trade finance arena. For instance, an increase in trade within borders, and failing to recognise this will see trade-based money laundering simply escape attention. Talking to clients is another important feature of taking responsibility. By doing so, we avoid what would happen when trade finance staff are performing their tasks in a tick box fashion. Actually, communicating with clients will also allow trade finance employees to gather information and insight into the trade being conducted and the level of risk. But this also presents a fantastic opportunity from a commercial perspective. So let's conclude then. Trade-based money laundering was, of course, already happening prior to the coronavirus pandemic. The threat remains, but its nature will have shifted. Trade-based finance staff need to respond quickly and efficiently to make sure that we can respond effectively but to the evolving threat. By looking at the wider risks, being aware of the last developments in trade-based money laundering, and taking responsibility for the different areas in which trade-based money laundering can occur, those who work in trade finance will give themselves the best opportunity of staying ahead of the threat, protecting themselves and protecting their organisation. My name is James Wood-Rickett, Course Director here at the International Compliance Association. Thank you for listening to me.